Our opening thought this morning comes from Bell Hooks, from her work, Teaching Community, a Pedagogy of Hope. She writes, education as the practice of freedom affirms healthy self-esteem in students as it promotes their capacity to be aware and live consciously. It teaches them to reflect and act in ways that further self-actualization rather than conformity to the status quo. Our next reading comes from the philosopher John Dewey, who wrote quite a bit about education, and I'll be reading from his work titled Democracy and Education. We're all instructors to realize that the quality of mental process, not the production of correct answers, is the measure of educative growth. Something hardly less than a revolution in teaching would be worked. Our next reading comes from Nikos Kazantzakis on True Teachers. True teachers are those who use themselves as bridges over which they invite their students to cross. Then, having facilitated their crossing, joyfully collapse, encouraging them to create their own. About once a year or so, I like to reflect on how education can contribute to our society and can help us cultivate what Martin Luther King Jr. called beloved community, and many others have called beloved community. When we think about education, and I hear this quite a bit from prospective students, and I also hear this quite a bit from parents of prospective students, a lot of times they're thinking about preparation for a job or preparation for a career. And when students come with that way of thinking, I certainly don't tell them that it's not about a job or not about a career. It certainly does prepare us for employment. It does prepare us for a career or perhaps a vocation, if you'd like to think about it in that way. But it's not what education is all about. Education is more than just preparation for a job or for a career. And when we think that that's what education is all about, we end up losing the opportunity for education to not only help us be employed, but to also help us become more fully responsible and free participants in the work of making beloved community a reality in our world. It allows us to become free and responsible persons within community, to participate more fully as persons in the beloved community. Education for beloved community must be more about the cultivation of wisdom rather than simply accumulating knowledge or information. It's not that knowledge or information is unimportant. We need knowledge, we need information, but we also need the cultivation of character. We need the cultivation of responsibility, and that's just as important, I would argue, even more important than preparation for employment. But we still tell the parents of our students that they will have a good chance of getting a job after their education. The most important function of education, I would suggest, is to help us come to know ourselves. Socrates said that, Aristotle said that, Plato through Socrates said that, to come to know ourselves more fully. And when we come to know ourselves more fully, we come to know ourselves as members of a broader community. And when we come to know ourselves as members of a broader community, we begin to ask ourselves, how do we contribute to this community? How do we contribute to its fulfillment? Education, in its many forms, and there are definitely many forms, can help us think clearly, critically, and creatively as we come to know how we can use our freedom in just, responsible, and sustainable ways. It's no accident, I won't beat this drum too long, but it is no accident that the most flourishing countries, the most flourishing democracies in the world, the happiest places in the world, the healthiest places in the world, also have the best education systems in the world, because they invest in a process of helping persons come to know themselves as members of the larger community. I would also suggest that education, if it's going to cultivate beloved community, must avoid becoming propaganda. The goal of propaganda is to persuade people, regardless of what the truth might be. Propaganda is running rampant in our, what many call, a post-truth society. Education, if it's going to cultivate beloved community, should focus on seeking the truth, cultivating wisdom, not simply persuading for the sake of persuasion. And an educated person, in terms of one who cultivates wisdom, is open to realizing that they may be wrong and should correct themselves when they are wrong, rather than simply trying to persuade for the sake of persuasion. Education should help us to be able to recognize misinformation and disinformation that is so often present in the propaganda that is permeating our society. It's not 100% foolproof in terms of helping us recognize that, but when we think critically and clearly, perhaps we're more able to recognize that misinformation and that disinformation. Seeking what is true is important, even if it makes us uncomfortable or does not fit with our worldview or with our political preferences. Seeking the truth is important. We also need education to help us to address the great and urgent challenges that we are facing in the world today, rather than simply ignoring them. Probably at some point, I remember my parents telling me this when I was young. They said, just because you're ignoring it doesn't mean it will go away. In fact, it will probably get worse. Ultimately, education does not do us much good unless it is helping us survive as a species in ways that are just, peaceful, and sustainable. This is why the cultivation of wisdom, rather than information and knowledge, is so important. It's not just about accumulation of information. Our society has accumulated more information and knowledge than any other society in the history of humanity. And things aren't necessarily going so well. We need education to cultivate wisdom. It's important to note also that education alone will not save us. As an educator, as someone who's worked now 28 years in higher education, actually 30 if you count 2 years as an adjunct, I'd like to say that education will save us, but it will not save us alone. Nazi Germany was one of the most educated countries in the world when it was Nazi Germany. And in my academic discipline of philosophy, Martin Heidegger was one of the most educated and famous, and many people would say most brilliant philosophers in the world during his time. But he also became a Nazi. Love must be at the heart of education in order for it to lead to wisdom, not simply information and knowledge. Otherwise, more knowledge and more information might actually make us more effective at perpetrating evil in the world rather than good. I would also suggest that education for beloved community requires the separation of church and state, something that is being forgotten in my state of Oklahoma right now, and I think it may be being forgotten in Texas as well, probably. We tend to go with each other along those lines. Anytime public education is used to promote one religion over others, it violates our religious freedom. It also runs the risk of creating more religious discrimination and prejudice within our communities. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, this was one of those areas where our founders got it right. Even though church and state should be separate in public education, though, I think we should realize that there is a role for religious education to play. A role for religious education to play in addressing the fierce urgency of now when it comes to our pressing global challenges. The progressive Christian author Brian McLaren, whose work I've been reading over the last few weeks, his most recent book is called Life After Doom. And in Life After Doom, he notes the need, the urgent need for religious education to contribute to solving our shared problems. He puts it this way. He says, "Part of me wants to grab every pope, bishop, denominational executive, pastor, and seminary professor by the lapels and start yelling, 'What the frack are you doing?'" He said frack, not. "What the frack are you doing? Arguing about theological trivialities while the world burns, worrying about preserving organ music and quaint architecture as the sixth mass extinction is unfolding. Why aren't you reorganizing everything? Rewriting every liturgy, restructuring every hierarchy, and revolutionizing all your priorities so that you can remobilize all of your resources to help save our precious, fragile planet? Aren't you supposed to be in the saving business? Don't you see? Without a healthy planet, there will be no healthy people, and certainly no healthy congregations, denominations, religions, or organ music." There's a role for religious education to play. Religious education can contribute to beloved community, but it shouldn't be done in our public schools. Education in its many forms, and as I said before, there are many forms. There's public and private, religious and non-religious, formal and informal. All those forms of education can help us learn more effectively how to work through our societal challenges and also our political differences in non-violent ways. When we come to know more fully who we are as ourselves, it helps us to have more empathy and understanding in relation to other persons. Education can also help us learn from history. History may not repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. Didn't Mark Twain say that, I think? Yes, that's one of those unknown whether it's really Mark Twain or not. Education can help us learn from history to see how problematic the use of violence is in our political life. Just a few words in relation to the events of yesterday. In relation to yesterday's experience of political violence, I've seen some really disturbing and dangerous comments from across the political spectrum last night and this morning before I left. I would just note that yesterday was a realization of one of my worst fears during this time, during this election cycle, but during any time really, for our very flawed and flailing democracy. When we get to the point of such polarization, vitriol, hate, and fear in our community and in our politics, and when we live in a society with easy and almost unlimited access to weapons that are designed to kill as many persons as possible, it makes our society extremely vulnerable to political violence. So I would say today and in the days ahead, we will see some very unhelpful responses to the violence that occurred yesterday. We can't control how others respond to what happened, But I urge us all to avoid conspiracy theories and attempts to gain political points off what happened yesterday. Political violence of any kind is not the way to beloved community. So let us not add any more fuel for more violence in what is already a very fragile and dangerous time for our country and for our communities. Hopefully, education in its many forms can help us move beyond this, move through this, move beyond this post-truth moment in our society that has contributed so much to the hatred, hostility, and fear that are so prevalent today. And hopefully, it can enable us to all understand that a sincere desire and search for the truth and wisdom is important, is vital in helping us cultivate beloved community. Hopefully, it can also help us cultivate a shared sense of our common reality. It seems like we don't have very much of a shared sense of our common reality. It's very bifurcated right now. Hopefully, we can have a better understanding together of what the underlying reality is that's contributing to the urgent problems and challenges that we are currently facing. May we all be engaged peacefully in lifelong learning so that we may fully use our freedom today and in the future in responsible ways as we all work together for a more just and beloved community. May it be so. Our parting thought comes from Charlotte Bronte. Prejudices, it is well known, are most difficult to eradicate from the heart, whose soil has never been loosened or fertilized by education. They grow there, firm as weeds among stones.